Okay. Last year was a tough year at your school. Several students in 8th grade made inappropriate racial remarks to an African-American middle school teacher. She quit and went to the local paper with her story. A 9th grader threatened his classmates with a gun over Snapchat, starting a waterfall of parent concerns. A beloved art teacher has cancer and is likely to pass away any day now, and the school is in an emotional turmoil. And I'm just going to point out, as we all know, things do happen in threes. Now, a new entrepreneur board member has been making side comments in and out of board meetings about how the head of school is not providing sufficient vision for the school and can't seem to carry his weight. He's also angling to be the vice chair next year. What happens now? David's brushing off his resume over here. Go visit the art teacher. Yes, put a little perspective in your day. As a board member, good, healthy board member, not that guy. What are you worried about? What are you thinking about? You're going to lose the head of your school. It's a very real concern. Yep. So you're worried about losing your head. You're worried about a civil war on your board. What else?
Worried about my school culture.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a lot of hits all at once.
But I'm thinking that the first and second go right to the heart of school culture and what's going on. And maybe I want to lose my head.
Yeah, so that's sort of a good tension, right? Evaluating your head, having your head doing a good job, and wanting to support your head and keep that stability in leadership. And how do they balance out when you're having these conversations? So we're seeing huge issues in leadership and governance relationships around the country. Amada referenced this before. And this really is, I have a friend who had this year, and then plus he had 2 rounds of somebody trying to burn down their school. He got the Silver Flask Award that year. And these are a lot of the points that Jack mentioned before. Tricky, if not impossible issues, spotlight with anxious parents, tight communities that have often replaced other support mechanisms. As people have gone to church less, they turn to places like schools to provide their overall community structure, and they're that much more embedded, ingrained, and invested in your school. With the most valuable commodity that they have with their children. So leadership has gotten much more complex in some ways. It happens faster, and the political tensions, the anxieties are so much higher than they ever were. And then on top of that, Amada, you want to talk about our heads turnover?
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier this morning that we are hearing more and more from individual schools that there are concerns about head turnover. And so that's the reason why we are starting a new study on governance. But if we just look at the numbers, what you can see here is how the number of the percentage of NIS schools with a new head has increased over time. But that data point that it was actually more concerning was the number of those new heads who were replacing previous head administrations after a very short period of time, 3 years or less. In the new study that we're doing, also a third of those heads are saying that in the last 10 years, they have been 3 different heads or more in their schools. So this idea of head tenure seems to be getting shorter now. And there was a time where we used to say it's around 8 years, and currently it seems to be around 5 years.
What's causing that?
That's part of the reason why we're doing the study. We have a lot of hypotheses. One of them is people say, well, again, baby boomers are ready to retire, but that is not explaining why we're seeing this shorter tenure. Another reason is because we're seeing some schools struggling in meeting enrollment numbers, and sometimes, a new head is hired with the expectation of making quick changes or solutions. Right, and if that is not happening quick enough, that might be another reason. We're also seeing some needs for understanding better what are the roles and all of these case studies are actually speak about that. What is the definition of, what are the boundaries between the role of the head and the role of the board? But in general, I mean, we are still, I think that there are a lot of reasons, and that's the reason why we're still conducting that research.
Yeah. What David's saying is there's a momentum piece to this. So once that churn begins, and just so board members know, the heads all know if you're crazy. They share that information with each other. But then you get flagged as a board where a head doesn't want to be, and then you're not going to get even remotely experienced heads coming into that position, and then you're not setting them up for success, and it churns like this. Yep.
I just want to say too that I think from my experience that the rate of actual change and the rate of accountability are not, if they're not in sync on the front end, then you're just really set up for, you're on divergent paths.
Right, exactly what our conversation about earlier when Amada had the slides up there, making sure that you're actually aligned for what your goals are. And this is where the evaluation piece makes me lose my mind. If you don't know what the goals are and what the evaluation is and you're not having honest conversations, this is so much more likely to happen, disproportionately so.
Just one quick piece of data, again, from the higher ed world. The average tenure for a college or university president now, just published recently, is 6.5 years. Now think about colleges and universities, and whether they're small liberal arts colleges or the University of South Carolina or whatever it is, how complex an institution they are. And in 6.5 years, boards of trustees are making decisions that this person isn't a good fit. It's the VUCA-U, and it's the lack of, it's about change and polarity management, and it's about boards saying we want you to change, and then the change starts, and then people object, and the board says, I think there are people objecting, and the board says, yeah, they are. We didn't want you to do it that way. We want you to do it another way. We need another dude. And off they go. Yeah.
And just quickly also, if we're really changing heads every 3 years, imagine what are the implications for any plans or any strategic decisions that you're making, right? It's such a short period of time.
Yeah, there are a lot of downsides to having that heads churn, but you lose your strategic momentum, right? It's just hard to keep things moving forward. And what does it cost to do a heads placement? Yeah, you have, the search for your head, and then you eventually start losing staff because they get tired of the perpetual change and perpetually having to step in. This data in front of you is from the Central States, and we're looking at SAIS data too and trying to figure out what our heads turnover looks like within our association. But that orange bar is 2 months or less between announcement and departure of the head of school. Yeah. And I'll just say, I've received any number of these phone calls too, and I used to call these body in the trunk cases, literally because there was one head who had a body in the trunk. But you didn't used to let heads go off cycle. I had conversations with 5 heads of school this summer from different parts of the country who were being let go over the summer for this academic year. That never used to happen.
And do you want to qualify that these aren't heads who've been, again, you have the data, who've been fooling around with the kids or the faculty or financial malfeasance? Those are 2 easy, happens, off you go. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
This, so I've had a lot of these conversations. I've actually spoken to the head who's sitting in the head's house on campus and has just been fired, and they need to move out in the next 3 days with their children who attend the school. I've probably had, solidly 50 or more of these conversations in the last 3-4 years. Bearing in mind that NES has a membership of 1,700 schools, and people will call me from all over the place. I still have people call me who don't live anywhere close to the South, and they're like, I just need a minute. And I bucket it. So I start thinking about these things. I start writing notes. Poor evaluation systems and communications, including exactly what Jack is talking about. You hire a change agent, and change is hard, and people are unhappy. And so that person can end up getting fired if we don't sort of adjust expectations, adjust timeframes, make a smarter situation. Lack of goals and objectives, lack of clarity, lack of systems. That's why I'm so crazy about the evaluation front. Poor succession planning for boards, and that's why we looked at the data to begin with. So is your vice chair truly becoming your chair? Is that person well situated to manage polarities, to manage tough conversations, to call people out who are riding off into the sunset someplace? Or are you moving up major donors? I love a good major donor. A major donor who's an entrepreneur, who's sort of retired with time on their hands, who think they want to run a school, they're not a great board member. And we've seen this more than a couple of times. And then from the board's standpoint, lack of understanding of the impact of that change. They just decide, oh, you know, this is a little too much drama. We're just going to let the head go in October. And I'm sure it'll be fine for the rest of the year. Well, you know, the associate head will just step in. If you fire a head in October, how much longer are you going to be paying them out? When is the head search cycle? It takes more than a year.
18 months.
Yeah, solidly 18 months. You can offset that. We're doing actually a nice conversation on heads contracts November 7th. But if you fire them right now or November, they've missed an entire search cycle. And so if you think that person's going to go quietly into the night with 3 months severance, you're crazy. And so you have to understand the internal churn of the politics at your school, but then also some of the financial side effects here. Poor training for heads is another one. Sometimes we're bringing in new heads and we're just not giving them the support that they need. And then that lack of engagement to accomplish goals. Sometimes the heads are checked out. I have worked with an attorney who's represented a lot of heads, and he's like, you know, that guy's now called me 3 times. He's been fired 3 times in the last 6 years. He's like, I'm starting to think it's not a school problem. I'm like, and I love Terry's optimism that now he's figuring that out. But, you know, that can be both sides of the equation. Here's an important fact that we actually did in the same governance data. This is the average age of heads of school. So not only do you have the churn from this leadership board support relationship, how is this working, but you've also got a lot of heads who are retiring soon, which means if you have a good head of school, you're going to really want to hang on to that person because other schools are going to be coming to recruit your head. Those nice search firms that helped you find your head, they know where they put your head the last time they saw them. It's really important to know this, too, that this is what the market looks like as a board and as a head. We at SAIS, we're going to be doing a study sort of complementary to the NEIS study to look at leadership qualities of good board leadership, but also what keeps ahead. Like, what are good supporting mechanisms? What should really common contract terms look like so that we can just start getting some best practices in place as an industry and give heads and boards something more to think about how do we support heads and how do we do this well.
I just wanted to add that given these numbers, it's important to going back to succession planning. Now, this is also the reason why we're advocating for having succession plans in place. And the other comment that I had was around search firms. We know that search firms normally will go first to a sitting head. No, actually, that's part of the challenge, that why the supply of heads is so small, I would say, because we tend to poach into each other, and when you look at the job descriptions, essentially all the characteristics are over and over describing a sitting head, which is also a challenge that we have. One of the big shifts that we saw was that in the old times, heads used to come from teaching backgrounds, right? And as you have seen and heard during this day, the demands for the job are switching more towards a CEO. And so we're having a crisis in the sense that even when aspiring heads talk to us, they are getting concerned, like, oh, wow, do I need to get very much into fundraising activities or being very familiar with numbers, because they feel like that is not necessarily what they had in mind as the head, as the role of the head. No, but what has been exacerbating this situation, I think, is the fact that we're going to see also in a bit, what is the number of schools that are losing their enrollment numbers. That is putting a lot of pressure on, on heads as well.
Your daughter Paige is in 12th grade. You overhear Paige and her friends discussing something that happened at a party last year. It sounds like one of the girls, Darby, was sexually assaulted at the party by another student, Dylan. You hear Darby say, I told Miss James about it when I went to see her last week in the counseling office, but I told her I didn't want to talk about it with anyone else. What happens? And you're the trustee.
Call your head of school.
Why would you call your head of school?
If there is an allegation of sexual assault in the building and the head of school doesn't know about it, they need to know. And if they do know about it, I want to know that they know about it, and then I don't want to know anything else.
Where does your mandatory reporting come in?
Yeah.
I mean, would you, I feel like there's almost like two separate tracks. Like, if you hear it, then you would need to call the child abuse hotline. And then maybe, I don't know, have a conversation with Darby and just confirm that in a non-threatening, in a way that they might feel more inclined to speak instead of being sort of intimidated or like they were in trouble or something. I don't know, but.
Did the counselor report it to the head of school? Did they exercise their obligations as mandated reporters? Did they tell the board chair that this has been reported? Those are the trustees' questions.
Okay, does everybody agree if you're a trustee, what obligation is triggering you calling the head? Fiduciary, there we go. So let's make this a little more complex. Darby's 18 and the party was during the summer.
Has she graduated?
Nope, because when we started redshirting everybody when they were in kindergarten, they now turn 18 as juniors in our schools. That makes things extra exciting. Where are my K-8 schools or K-6 schools? Yeah, I'm just letting you know that this actually happens in your schools too. They're not 18, you don't have the 18 out yet.
The great thing about the mandated reporter law is when in doubt, report and let them decide.
It's still your fiduciary duty because the counselor can never tell the student that that has to be part of what the counselor does, saying, I'll try to keep confidentiality, but there's laws and there's safety and everyone concerned. So that can open up the lawsuits in the future, so your fiduciary duty is to make sure the counselor is doing the right thing.
Yeah, so when they're 18, can you report? How many say yes? How many say no? How many say I'm really glad I'm a middle school or an elementary school? It is a really tricky issue because actually in a lot of states, you might still report or try to report. You wouldn't necessarily give names to the family services thing, but you wouldn't. At over 18, you actually call the police. And when you're talking about sexual assault, a lot of times you call the police anyway. It's a victim's right issue that you can't actually report in a lot of states when they're over 18. But if it happened before she was 18, you usually run into this loophole in the law that creates a lot of ambiguity about what happens and what should happen. The counselor piece is really important. And this isn't so much a board issue, but making sure that you have a school counselor. As independent schools, we have like the biggest ragtag hodgepodge of licensures and things happening in our schools with school counselors, and who tells what to whom, and what are the privileges, and what the counselor thinks the privileges are, and where those flow. You need to iron all of that out before this happens. Like, bring this home, build muscle memory around it. So, the school reports the issue to the police, who are now investigating. The students are all aware of what is happening, as several kids have been contacted by the police. The parents in the class are taking sides. What does the administration do? What does the board do? And I will tell you, this is exactly what happens. This is one of the hardest things that schools deal with now across the board, is, and it's why young women have started to wait until they're 18 before they talk to the school counselor, because they want to try to control the three-ring circus that their life turns into when we start doing investigations and we bring police in and all kinds of things start to happen. So what do you do when this is unfolding in your community? What do you want the board to do? Zip it. As a board, what kind of communication do you want to get from your head of school and administrative team about what's happening? Yeah, somebody said it's in the police's hands. What else do you think was present during this incident? How interested is the police in something that happened that they can't corroborate, they're not going to get functional investigations and interviews out of?
They're not interested at all.
They're not interested at all. I've got a school, and they're still waiting. They reported 3 months ago, and the police have done nothing. And when you're an educational institution, on this front, particularly when Title IX doesn't apply, you're usually sitting and waiting for the police to do something. Because if you take a statement from this boy, what are you asking him to do? What was that?
You're asking for his side of the story, which creates a legal mess.
Yeah. Rutledge, what does that look like?
Does he have to cooperate? He doesn't have to.
No, he could leave. But if he cooperates in the police, or you get a subpoena for his statement,
So you have to give it up.
you have to give it up if you have it.
Don't you let the police go first?
But if they're not doing anything,
Do you keep him on campus?
yeah, do you keep him on campus? Are they, if she says, I just don't want to be in the same class with him, and you only have one section. Yeah, so all that's fun. Administrative teams, heads of school, you want to work this through. You want to, if you've got a high school, work it through with the 18-year-old twist in it, work it through with the school counselor. For boards, and again, you'll have these slides, these are all of the different kinds of policies that tend to go into place when you've got these situations unfolding on your school. The education piece has become huge with sex ed. A lot of states now are adopting Aaron's laws. You've got to do a certain amount of education anyway when it comes to sex abuse. More and more schools are just doing more on sexuality education. There's a ton of resources out there on this front.